looks more natural.
Okay, we're live. We'll give like 5 minutes for people to start joining. Yeah.
I'm gonna be right back then. You got 5 minutes, okay.
Yeah. Dr. Lurman, I was wondering, what are your quarantine hobbies?
Um, I've just been watching a lot of TV. I've tried to read, but like mostly short things. But yeah, a lot of TV, a lot of movies and things that I just, didn't normally have time to catch up on. And then, of course, a lot of baking. You know, I've been doing a lot more baking than what I normally do. So I don't know if that's been good for my sugar levels, but I've been trying to like just, seemingly every day I'm baking something new. So those have been my hobbies. What about you?
My hobbies have been I started watching RuPaul's Drag Race.
Mhm.
Um, it's been good, and I've been reading more than I read during the school year, so that's really
Mhm.
good too. Um, yeah, that's I think that's all I've been doing. I don't bake. I tried
Mhm.
I tried baking banana muffins, but like from the box, and I forgot the eggs. Um, yeah, so I forgot that. They were still really good, but I didn't
Mhm.
realize.
Mhm. But they didn't probably rise properly, right? Because you didn't have the eggs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, no. I forgot the oil. Yeah, no,
Oh, okay, 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 okay.
no, the oil. And that's why the texture was a little bit weird, but
Yeah.
but they were still good.
Okay, well, I think that, you get more into it. I will say this, you get more into it as you grow older. I know when I was in college, cooking was not something I did. And then, even when I first, I had my first job, I wasn't really doing a lot of cooking. And then I just think, you get older and you realize how much money you're spending on eating out and all of that stuff. And then just, I don't know, you start cooking more, and baking is like an easy way to cook. So, it's like chemistry, so yeah, it can be a little, and then if you mess it up, it's usually you can still eat it, it just might not be the greatest thing. Whereas I feel like sometimes with savory or like, more traditional meal recipes, if you mess it up, it's like you can't really salvage it, sometimes. And sometimes, if you're cooking with meat, the ingredients can be very expensive, whereas with baking, it's kind of like, okay, you lost a couple of cups of flour, but, you know, it's not a disaster if you have to throw it away because it doesn't come out. So,
Yeah, maybe when I grow up, I'll cook more. But right now, my mom cooks for me because I'm back home.
yeah,
Uh,
no, that's great. I will just tell you this: pay attention to your parents' cooking. I wish I had, I wish I had.
yeah, if everybody's watching, tell us what your quarantine hobbies are. We'll love to hear them. Um, so now it's 3:05, so I'll just introduce for everybody that's watching. Um, so Dr. Xavier Liverman is an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He has published widely in the fields of African popular culture and African queer studies in journals including GLQ, Feminist Studies, and Black Music Research Journal. His book with Duke University Press, Quato Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, discusses the rise of post-apartheid South African popular culture and its articulation with contemporary politics of race, gender, and sexuality. The Senate of College Councils is hosting this teach-in webinar called Queerness in the Black Lives Matter Movement. I hope you all are all as excited to hear more about Professor Liverman's studies. And yeah, you can go ahead, Professor.
All right. Thank you, Suseth, for that introduction. I'd like to welcome everybody here. The way I just some quick ground rules for just kind of how I'm framing all of what we're going to talk about today. First and foremost, a lot of the material that I'm going to be discussing is somewhat introductory. I'm kind of taking an introductory framework to the conversation. So, I don't know exactly where everybody's coming from as far as what their background knowledges are. So, but I do invite those of you who are a little more familiar with these materials and topics to definitely ask questions, ask for more specificity, ask for more depth, when we're in the Q&A. But my intention here is to kind of, introduce a set of concepts and ideas for folks to think about in relationship to this question of the convergence between queerness and the Black Lives Matter movement. Secondly, my approach to this conversation is intersectional. So, and not per se with respect to identity, right? I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand what intersectionality is about and kind of think of it as about a confluence of identities, but more in relationship to, or even as a lifestyle matter, right? But more in relationship to um, how different kinds of oppressions coalesce onto an individual body, right? So that you can have different kinds of material and social oppressions or lack of opportunities, or that kind of coalesce into one individual or into a group of individuals, right? And then the third thing that I'll say is that my remarks are also kind of informed by a Black radical tradition. And so I kind of explicitly am critical of certain kinds of neoliberal or reformist types of solutions in this conversation. That doesn't mean that I lack pragmatism. I definitely think that sometimes you have to engage things slowly but surely and in a pragmatic manner. But I think that my approach is to sort of suggest that that what is required in this moment is more than just kind of a reform of things that are happening right now, but that that we really need to rethink and rebuild and dismantle some things and build something anew, right? So I just kind of wanted to start the conversation with kind of those three opening frameworks. And I think that we just had something happen today that I think gives us an opportunity to think about that intersection of queerness and Black Lives Matter. And I'm sure if those of you who are here in the state of Texas right now, know that you've either received via a text message or email or phone call something telling you that you'll be needing to wear a mask if you're outside in public. And in any public building, or face the possibility of the $250 fine. Now, let me be clear. I definitely think we should all be wearing masks when we're out. But what I am concerned about is the punitive nature for those who don't wear masks, particularly because we know that policing disproportionately affects Black and Brown bodies, right? We know that it is quite disproportionate on queer and trans bodies within those communities, right? So it begins to ask a question: is there a way that we know also from previous public health campaigns, right, that punitive measures um, in relationship to public health don't actually always work, or don't normally work, right, to get the desired public health outcome. So, I do worry about who's going to be subjected disproportionately to those $250 fines, right? We also know that there's a history of people who, because they can't pay fines, end up in jail and in the carceral system. So it's just something to literally think about in relationship to something that's happening right now, and how that might, something that seems relatively innocuous or seems like a good thing on paper, right, has this element of the policing of bodies, the policing of particular kind of people, and how we know that that's disproportionately applied to Black people, to Black queer and Black trans folks. So that was just kind of just to get us kind of thinking about some of the ideas that I'm hoping to touch upon. With respect to the overall conversation that I had prepared for today, one of the things that I want to say is that when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm speaking here about a kind of larger set of movements that are not necessarily reduced to Black Lives Matter as an organization or its affiliate organizations, right? So when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm kind of talking about the larger movement that's happening at this time, which of course is inclusive of Black Lives Matter as an organization, but not completely contained by that. So I just wanted to kind of make that clear that I'm kind of referring to the larger movement. Um, the other thing that was really important for me to point out, and that I think is really important for us to think about when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, is to see the current movements as connected to and having continuity with a longer tradition of political activism in Black communities, what we might call a Black freedom movement or a Black radical tradition, right? That Black Lives Matter comes forth from that. It is a continuation of that. Um, and I think it's important to connect what we're seeing now with these previous movements so that we place Black Lives Matter into the larger Black radical tradition, into the larger Black tradition of, um, you know, pushing for freedom for Black people, pushing for an understanding of Black people as human, right? I mean, a lot of what we're pushing for is that, right? Um, within that, so if we understand that this is part of a larger historical tradition, then the other thing that we have to also recognize is that Black queer people have always been a part of this journey to Black freedom, right? They've always been there, right? They've always impacted these movements, whether we go back to something like Black Power, whether we go back to the Civil Rights Movement, um, Black queer people were present, right? And so I think that it's important to remember that that's the case both for Black liberation movements and queer liberation movements, right? That there have been Black queer people instrumental and participating in those movements throughout history so that we don't see what's happening now as an aberration, but we see it as a kind of continuation of a set of ways that Black queer people have been involved in various different kinds of liberation movements, various different kinds of um, social movements that have tried to kind of to fight for freedom. So then if we can understand that, then we can get at what we think may be different that's happening now. Like what are the shifts, right? So if I've told you guys kind of what, what is what's happening that seems similar or is in continuity, then I want to talk very briefly about what I do see as some shifts or what I do see as some things that are different now, right? And I think that one thing to remember, of course, is that this contemporary movement comes out of a set of specific state violences that have been experienced by Black people, right? So we remember that this comes out of the Trayvon Martin case, right? And the fact that, George Zimmerman is still free, right? And that building upon that were the Ferguson movement and what happened in Baltimore and so forth, right? So that we had all of these things kind of happening simultaneously that Black Lives Matter was able to latch onto and amplify, right? And I think that when I look at what the things are that are distinct about this particular era of how Black queer people come into activism, is that first and foremost, Black queer activists have been more vocal, right? And less willing to kind of sideline their Black queerness in relationship to their activism. Um, if we think about some of the major figures from civil rights movement, such as Bayard Rustin or James Baldwin, there were ways in which they either sidelined or didn't talk about their sexuality in a particular kind of way. And there are ways in which they are still in some ways not remembered. I think particularly someone like James Baldwin, not remembered for their queerness, right? So that we can have entire conversations about James Baldwin that barely mention, that this person was queer, right? And we have to think about the ways that in order for him to be seen as a particular kind of leader of the Black civil rights movement, let's say, then he had to be kind of seen unseen, right, or not recognized, right, as queer. And so that kind of disconnection, right, I don't think that that's something that younger Black queer people are willing to be a part of any longer, right? And so that is one thing that has clearly changed, that Black queer activists themselves are being more vocal about their queerness. They're not sublimating their queerness to larger movements, right? With respect to their involvement in larger queer movements, they're not sublimating their Blackness on the one hand, and they're not sublimating their queerness on the other, right? They're insisting that these movements deal with the whole of who they are as a person. And of course, that's not new, but I think there's a new vocality to it, right? There's a new insistence on it. And there's a new insistence that these kinds of movements for Black lives must begin with precepts that are informed by Black feminism and Black queerness, right? And that to me is definitely somewhat new in that insistence and that sort of putting in the forefront. The other thing that I would say, though, that is different is the use of social media. I mean, it is absolutely the use of social media and the way that social media has been able to amplify voices that were otherwise marginalized. So, as just a quick aside, right, I'm just going to say that we know that much of the mainstream media is controlled by people who are from the wealthy elite of the country and the world. And we know that what then gets presented in that mainstream media oftentimes you know, is information that doesn't really rock the boat too much, right? And then when you do get people who are from marginalized groups, they oftentimes either are, are relatively not, they're relatively palatable, let's say, right, to a mainstream audience. And so part of what social media has allowed to do is it has allowed us to hear the voices of people who wouldn't be, who wouldn't have access to mainstream media ordinarily, right? And then they've been able to use that position to shift the conversation, right? To shift the conversation toward a more inclusive and more radical Black Lives movement, right? And so that is something that, you just couldn't necessarily have access to before the advent of social media. Now, let me also point out, of course, that social media is also corporatist, right? And there are many ways in which it reproduces many of the same hierarchies, many of the same marginalizations of the conventional media, right? But there's a way in which I can have a particular kind of conversation. I can organize. I can hear the voices of Black trans folk. I can hear the voices of non-mainstream Black queer folk that I just wouldn't be able to have access to ordinarily, right? And I think that that has shifted the conversation around Black Lives Matter and around contemporary Black activism and Black social movements. Um, so I think the other thing that I just want to, consistently reiterate is that Black Lives Matter doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? It comes out of a long array of post-civil rights movements that have been happening, some of them very small. Like sometimes it's just, a community garden organization, right, that wants to make sure that healthy and fresh food is being provided in a community where corporate grocery stores have disinvested, right? Sometimes it's a different kind of movement, right? But it's a lot of these small movements that have been pushing back against state disinvestment, against certain kinds of logics whereby Black people are over policed, right? That have all existed and that kind of informed, Black Lives Matter. So yes, I think it's important to point out that the founders of Black Lives Matter, that two of the three of them are Black queer folk themselves, right? That two of the three of them are Black queer women. I think that's important to point out, and that obviously informed the philosophy, right? That became a really big part of the movement. But I think it's also important to note that that kind of activism around centering um, non sort of cishet voices was something that was happening on the ground in various different kinds of activist spaces anyway, right? Like it was something that was a part of particular kinds of activism. And then I also want you to think about, like, when you see what's happening in Minneapolis, you have to understand that that's not just something that pops up as a result of George Floyd being murdered. Instead, it's about a long kind of, recent history of Black activism in Minneapolis that has been pushing for things, trying to demand things, organizing young people so that they were already organized in a very particular kind of way, so that they could respond to what happened when George Floyd was murdered, right? So it's not that this just sort of pops out of nowhere, and I think that that's important um, to to um, to remember. Um, the other thing that I want to say is that if we kind of understand all of these, I think all of these different issues, is that we need to think about, at the end of the day, what is the evidence that all Black lives matter, right? Which I think is the issue that Black queer and Black trans folk are trying to push, right? We don't necessarily see that evidence in the way that Black queer and Black trans people are subjected to more increased rates of death or dislocation or marginalization, right? And we also don't, frankly, see it in the ways that people whom we are in solidarity with either show up or don't show up for us when we are the victims of state violence, right? So when you look at what's happening, so when you look at the kinds of disproportionate responses, let's say, to the murders of Black women, to the murders of Black trans women, to the murders of Black men that are not cisgendered and heterosexual, we don't see the same kind of political response, right? We don't see the same kind of political response from folks that we are supposed to be in solidarity with, right? And that is whether that is various different kinds of Black activist organizations, or frankly, whether that's various different kinds of queer activist organizations. The response is still not there in either case. And I think this is the question that Black queer and Black trans folks are trying to ask right now. And it is a question that I think is unresolved at this point. But it's also one that is going to be critical to whether or not this particular iteration of the Black freedom struggle, and we can frankly add the queer freedom struggle to that as well, if we'd like. But this particular iteration of the Black freedom struggle, is it just going to kind of reproduce, some of the same limitations and some of the same failures that we've seen from previous movements as far as people being excluded, right? And of course, part of the argument that Black queer and Black trans folk are making is that if our lives matter in a particular kind of way, it really, because we are oftentimes the most marginalized, right, within communal formations, it actually would make everyone's lives matter in a particular kind of way. Like the rights of, if we can protect the rights, if we can see the humanity of Black queer and trans folk, that translates, like, to people with more social and political capital, right? Um, so I think that that's, that's really important. And I think I will also say that for a lot of Black queer and trans activists right now, um, they're not overly invested in what's happening with queer rights movements right now because they've been so failed by those movements, right? And those movements have seemed to have a fidelity, right, to certain kinds of practices um, of, you know, of assimilation, of, joining in with, American empire and militarism and so forth, right? And not really thinking about economic questions. And so, Black queer and Black trans people feeling like, well, where do we fit in with this, right? And I think that we're seeing on the side of queer activism a bit more of a radical queer activism emerging right now. And so my question to that would be, is that a movement that will be able to, how can I say this, will be able to deal with its anti-Black racism, right? Um, and on the flip side, right, I think that for Black queer and Black trans activism, um, folks have been maybe doing more work in solidarity with other kinds of Black activist movements because they see that at least those movements are critiquing the American state in particular kinds of ways, critiquing various different forms of inequality. And they see, okay, well, there's maybe something we can work with here, right? But I think the question for both groups of people, and if we see this sort of reemergence of activism in this moment, right, and this attempt to try to change something, I think the question ultimately will be, are we able to deal with anti-Black racism as it manifests itself both outside the Black community and within the Black community, right? Are we able to deal with, and are we able to deal with heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia and misogyny as they manifest themselves, right? And if we're not able to kind of ask those hard questions and tackle those things, then I think that you're going to have a movement that in many ways fails to represent the complexity and the diversity of our society, and the complexity and diversity of the Black community itself. And so, as Black queer people and Black trans people engage in different kinds of activism and ask and demand, actually, let me use the word demand, that their lives have meaning, that I should say our lives have meaning, right? Our lives have meaning. We're human beings. We have the right to fight for the same kinds of, um, I think, yeah, the same kinds of citizenship that anyone else would have, right? The same kinds of ability to live free, to breathe, right? To exist, right? As anyone else has. Then I think that what you will see is a truly, progressive radical movement that could change and shape society in a way that we're not revisiting these same questions yet again 20 or 30 years down the road. Right. And I think that that's the question that right now Black queer and Black trans folk are posing to the larger society, to the Black Lives Matter movement, um, and asking for some answers, and I think that if we can mobilize with the same fervor around the death of a Black trans woman as we do around the death of a Black cisgender heterosexual man, then I think we will have really moved somewhere, right? We would have really moved somewhere as a society if we can care as much about that loss of life as we do the other loss of life. So I think with that, we've hit the 3:30 mark. So I think I want to make sure I leave the rest of this time for questions. So I'm going to, I think, stop the kind of formal presentation and then, kind of ask people if they have questions that I can answer.
Yes. So the Google form is still up there. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lieberman. I was taking notes of everything that you just said. And just for the viewers, there is a Google form that you can submit your questions anonymously. You can also just type them into the chat. But we did submit some questions, so I'm going to start asking those to you, Dr. Lieberman.
Yeah.
So the first question that we have, can you speak about pragmatism and abolition? How do you respond to critiques that an abolitionist framework is not pragmatic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would start by saying that I think abolitionism is a framework that's existed for far longer than I think it's kind of recent engagement right now around, I think, in particular prison, right? Abolishing prisons and abolishing the kind of prison industrial complex. So I think that's one place where um I'll say there's certain kinds of limits to questions of pragmatism. So I actually don't see the I don't see abolition of the prison industrial complex as necessarily unpragmatic, right? But as a pragmatic maneuver, I can say, here's some things we can do immediately until we can get to that point, right? So if the end game is abolition, one thing we can do just immediately is decrease police budgets by 50%, right? And then allocate that monies to social programs, right? So right now, during the middle of everything that's going on, we've seen numerous cities, in fact, increase their police budgets and cut their funding for schools, right? So to me, the opposite should be done, right? So I mean, that would be my pragmatic gesture, right? Like I'm willing to say, like, okay, I'm not saying we're going to wake up tomorrow and every police force is going to be disbanded or non-existent, right? But I will say that, here's a very quick pragmatic thing we can do, right? That would that would immediately decrease some of the kinds of violences that Black and brown bodies are subjected to here in this country, in the state of Texas in particular, right? That's just an immediate thing that we could do. That to me is very pragmatic. But I just also want to remind people that as late as 1860, right, there were people saying that the end of slavery, the abolishment of slavery, was not a pragmatic thing, you know, um, and yet 5 years later it was gone. Right. So I think that part of it is that we have to challenge ourselves um, to have an imagination that is more expansive than that which we've been presented with. Right. And it does sometimes also mean that we don't know what the outcome of that thing is going to be. Right. But I think if we do know that what's happening now isn't working, then I think it's okay to say, hey, it needs to be dismantled. And we don't exactly 100% know what's going to be replaced with it. Um, but whatever is there now needs to be dismantled, right? And we can kind of, and there are models for it. I mean, numerous people have thought about this, right? Numerous people have talked about, well, what do you do with a lot of people who would be out of middle class jobs if they couldn't be police officers? Well, we have, people have thought about ideas around that, right? We've thought about how we would deal with rapist and sexual violence, right? I mean, so people have thought about that. So I think that I, I think for me, I would say that I don't want to allow pragmatism to be the enemy of imagination. Um, and I think that we have to challenge ourselves, especially young folks who are in the process of learning these things and getting exposed to these ideas, have to challenge themselves to kind of have some kind of imagination that moves forward. So for example, one of the things that we know is that a lot of the facial recognition technology that's being used by police to identify criminal suspects is totally faulty. So can we take a step back maybe and look at people who are coders and programmers and working in tech and say, why are you even developing this technology? Like, what is what is the ethics of developing this technology? Right. To what end is it being used? Right. And to maybe ask some questions about, about why that, why be involved in developing this technology? Why not use your ability to develop new technologies towards something else, right? That's not about enhancing the police state. So yeah.
Yes, thank you. And just for the viewers out there, like Dr. Lieberman said, like there are social sorry activists that have been doing the work, like Mariam Kaba, like her work is out there.
Mm.
So you don't have to go through the imagination process alone when there's people that have been doing the work for like 30 years, right? So the next question that I have is going to be UT specific. So in the context of UT Austin, how can our community, whether it be students, professors, faculty, admin, better advocate and support Black queer folks?
Wow. um I think that there's a lot of different ways. I mean, I think one way is to I think listen, right, to what Black, and I think there's a lot of, like, in this moment, there's a lot of we're listening and learning, right? But what I mean by that, so I don't mean that kind of facile thing where you make claims to listening and you're not actually listening, right? But I think, one of the things is to I think that that's one of the things that you can do is listen to what people's experiences are, and let's think about ways that we um, can improve situations. I mean, one of the things that I would say that could immediately be done is, to think about, like, why do we need a police force? Or can we reduce that significantly? Are there ways that we can fund um, more counselors and support systems for Black queer people? I know that for the longest time, there wasn't even a Black counselor in student counseling services at UT, right? And so, what does that mean? I mean, can we make sure we get, Black queer counselors there, right? I mean, are there other ways that we can support, Black queer students, right? And I think I answer the question in that way because as a faculty member, right, I don't presume to know what it is that Black queer students specifically need, right? And I think that part of what I would say is that, let's find out what is needed, and then let's actually do what is needed, not just find out what's needed and then shelve it and not think about it again, right? But my sense is that many Black queer students, like many Black students at UT, are, struggling with, finances, right? Struggling with various different kinds of alienations because they are in majors or, in learning environments that are not neither Black friendly or queer friendly for that matter, right? So I think that doing more to, I think, support students materially, like literally financially, right, would be just one step in the right direction, right? But also dealing with things like housing and food insecurity as well. Like, we know that a lot of students are, not necessarily food secure, right? So what are ways besides the kind of corporate system of getting food to students, right, that we can do? I mean, maybe we could have some kind of program that, allots, some kind of EBT to students, right? So that we can make sure that students are not food insecure. So these are just, things that are coming, to the top of my mind. I mean, we have a fairly Robust Black queer studies at this institution. I think we can always do more. We can hire more Black queer faculty. We can have more people teaching in Black queer studies. But obviously that's an important just aspect of the educational program, right? And I just think that like when we're thinking about policy and what we're doing on this campus, I think that one way is to always think about, well, how does that impact, Black queer people, right? So even something like the reopening that's happening, is that being done with any kind of care? Is that being done with any kind of care towards students in particular? Um, if so, how so? Right. So I think that's what I would say, about how we can do more to support UT students.
Thank you for that. Um, Sorry, I'm like looking through the questions. So there was a question about that just came in. They said, can we hear a few more names of individuals who are doing the work to reimagine policing post-abolitions and other problematic structures? Sorry, I'm gonna plug in Senate for a bit. We actually did a teaching about 2 weeks ago about what does divesting from the police mean, from two students that like are very educated about abolition. And they actually like, we have the live in our Senate page, and we also have like Sarah, she's a student. She like did a whole article with like resources. But if Dr. Liverman has any more resources.
Yeah, I mean, the big people, I mean, Critical Resistance, out of California, I tend to go towards scholars because that's what I know. But of course, Miriam Kaba, very, succinct, quick writer, someone you can jump in and really figure out what's going on. Angela Davis, of course, the Our Prisons Obsolete is like a Bible of prison abolition. And I think it's available for free PDF. It's literally something you can sit down and read in an afternoon. It's very accessible language, very clear language. If you're kind of going for something a little more scholarly, then, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. There was also a really great article on Ruth Gilmore in the New York Times last year that was around prison abolition. So you could even read that article that was, I think it was in the Sunday Times Magazine, which I think as students at UT, you should have access to the archives of the New York Times. So I would even recommend just reading that. That's a short article that kind of introduces you to Dr. Gilmore's ideas. And you can kind of run with it there if you decide you want to read more of what she has. She also has a lot of things online, a lot of conversations that she's had that you can access via YouTube. So those are just additional resources that I would, encourage people to take a look at.
Yeah, thank you for that. My next question is, I have recently seen a lot of discourse around media portrayal of queer folk serving as a narrative of assimilation and homonormativity being harmful to the queer community. What constitutes an assimilative narrative, and how can this be avoided?
I'm not sure it can be totally avoided, honestly. So look, I think an assimilative narrative is one that kind of suggests that our current economic, political, and social structure is fine, right? There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is that X group of people, we can name whatever that X group of people are excluded from that narrative, right? So for example, the problem um, isn't, I don't know, let's just say white suburban middle class society, right? The problem is that Black people are excluded from it. And if we just bring Black people into it, then we've resolved all the problems, right? If we just bring queer people into it, then we've resolved all the problems. So I think that media portrayals, frankly, are oftentimes a part of that narrative, right? And they're part of that narrative because because ultimately the media exists to sell products, right? And, oftentimes what you're trying to sell is this aspiration of wealth, luxury, or higher class status, right? And so to me, one of the greatest examples of this is Queer Eye, right? It's a really good example of that. It's this it's a show where people are kind of taught that they can buy their way to happiness and success, right? And that they can kind of, I mean, you literally have, and that's to say nothing of the kind of racialized labor that's happening in the show, where the black queer character is the spiritual advice. I mean, and I hate to use the word character because I don't necessarily think that Cromwell's acting per se, but where the person is kind of required to do the work, the kind of labor of, like, you know, I don't know, helping fix these people's spiritual and kind of, emotional disconnect, right? And it's always in a very superficial way, right? Like, I mean, to me, spiritual matters take deep study, right? And engagement. They're not something that a few sound bites and a couple of days of talking, are necessarily going to resolve. So I think that, you can think of that show as a particular kind of example of those kinds of portrayals. And I don't think those are ever going to go away, because, the purpose of media is not to rock the boat, right? Or to change, and to necessarily radically change anything, right? But I think that what you can do, I mean, what we can demand as viewers, right? So two things that we can do as viewers: we can support the projects of people who are kind of pushing back against that or doing something a little bit different, right? And I think that it's imperative that we do that. And look, I mean, I think Pose is a great example of a show that does a little bit of both, right? I think that, there was a lot of, to me, very weird focus on the pairing of these kind of poor and working class trans women of color with kind of elite white men, right? And this kind of notion that that's what they should desire, and this is what made them whole, was to have these relationships with wealthy or relatively privileged white men, right? And so to me, that's an example of a kind of assimilation narrative that the show had, right? But the show also presented other things, right, that were very much not about that at all, right? And so some shows are mixed, right? Some representations are mixed in what they offer. But I think it's important for what we can demand as viewers. We can demand to see a wider array, right, of representation, but we can also support the few things that are out there that are doing something different, right? And once again, I have nothing wrong with, like, a queer fantasy where people live in fabulous apartments and drive great cars and work really high paying jobs. There's nothing wrong with that. But when that becomes the only representation, when we know that, particularly for queer people of color, they're often working class, they're often working poor, they're often struggling with economic issues as much as they're struggling with issues related to their queerness, right? And I think that narratives that speak to that are important to see. I do just want to say, though, that in US media representation, rarely is the working class or the working poor represented, right? And there are very few shows over the years that have done that kind of representation, and we could ask questions as to why.
Thank you for that. So I have the next question. You spoke a lot about ideas of radical activism. How can these forms of activism be sustainable and not quickly die out against the threats of American complacency?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things, right? I want to reiterate that I think that this kind of radical activism has always been going on, right? I think that the thing is that it is the particular circumstances of our moment right now have made it more visible in particular kinds of ways. And we know that it's still going on now, even though the media may not cover it, right? Um, even though we may not have as much attention paid to it. So I think that for me, I would just simply say that, look, whatever it is that you're doing, right? If you're invested in some kind of activism, whatever it is that you're doing, I think that you guard against the complacency in your organization with the people that you're in community with. You can't necessarily account for um, what those outside the community are going to do and don't do. And of course, there are times where, like, at some point, some people have to say, hey, for my mental and emotional health, I need to step back from activism for a little bit, right? Or because I kind of need a high paying job in order to take care of my mother and I'm going to have to step back from certain things, right? So I'm not talking about people who have to make those kinds of difficult decisions. I'm just simply saying that I think that the attention that comes from outside, right, or the focus, right, that comes from outside of activist communities is going to wane, right? That's going to come and go, right? What if you're committed to the activism, though, you have to kind of be, I think, ready to be in community and to work towards these ends, even when it is a city council meeting that's literally only attended by 10 people, right? And one of the things that I would also just consistently point out is that we have a fetishization in this country for national politics. But honestly, a lot of work can be done at the local level. A lot of times, and it actually doesn't take as much as it seems like it sometimes does, to just begin changing things at your city council, at your school board. A lot of times these people are, they're used to these meetings with 5 people in them, and no one really carrying or pushing one way or the other. You show up with 100 people and you guys start making certain demands, right? It's gonna start, it has the potential to shift certain things, right, at the local level. So I guess that's just what I would say, is that, I don't know 100% how we guard against complacency. um I think we just have to think about our own activism and guarding against our own complacency. I don't think we can necessarily account for larger society kind of forgetting about something, because we already know that that's the pattern, right? I mean, it's not that that the Black Power movement just died out spontaneously in the 70s, right? It was just that it stopped receiving a certain kind of attention, right? But there were things that people were doing into the 80s, into the 90s, and a lot of that sowed, the seeds, so to speak, if I can use that agricultural metaphor, for, some of the things we're seeing today. So, like, for example, we've mentioned Miriam Kaba a couple of different times, right? I mean, she's been doing this since the 90s, guys. You know what I'm saying? I mean, now that she's just getting attention for it in the year 2020 doesn't change the fact that she's been involved in this struggle for so long. So I think that, I think it's about being ready to take advantage of moments like this and media attention when it comes, but understanding that it's not likely to be there. It's not likely to galvanize the larger population, that the larger population is oftentimes complacent and not willing to do some of the hard work. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we've gotten a few questions with similar wording about what what does it mean to go past symbolic activism or like performative activism, because I know where you were talking about like how social media has become like an incredible tool, but at the same time, like the voices that are being amplified are also people that may have more privilege. So there's some questions about what does it mean to go beyond that performative activism, and if you have any resources, tools that you want to provide, like right now.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I definitely don't have per se resources or tools, but one of the things that I will always say is that um I think that one way that you can always kind of think about. So look, here's one thing I'll say. First and foremost, I would disarticulate symbolic from performative activism, right? Because I do think there's certain things that are symbolic that have meaning and are important. For example, Confederate statues on our campus, right? Like someone could argue that that's just symbolic. Like taking down the statue, does that change anything in the lives of a black student on campus or a Latinx student on campus? Like, what did that really do? Right. But I actually think that there is some value, right? Like we spend a lot of time understanding what the value of representation is. And we all, I think, understand fundamentally that there's a value to that, right? So I think that certain now, I would say symbolic kinds of activism is not enough. Like it's a nice gesture and it needs to be done in some cases, but it's not, enough in and of itself, right? Um Performative activism is another thing, right? I think that, and look, I think there will always be people who get engaged in performative activism. I think we saw a lot of that with people who were, tweeting different kinds of things about Black Lives Matter that were completely contradictory to things they were saying literally weeks before, like in some cases days before, right? So I think that bringing attention to that behavior and holding people accountable for that is, I think, really important. But I think the other thing that I would also say is that if you see yourself being positioned as someone who is being given opportunities or being allowed to speak on something, always think about, is there someone else I could bring in that actually has more experience or could do this in addition to me? Or could do this instead of me, right? Like how do I kind of bring the shine or the attention, to the people who are most affected by these conversations, right? So for example, you know, um I do a lot of work in South Africa, right? I'm oftentimes asked to comment on or speak about something in relationship to South Africa. And I normally will always say, look, I'm American, I'm relatively privileged to be in the Western Academy. Um, I'm fine with speaking with you, but here's some South African scholars, here's some South African activists who are doing the work, right? On the ground, and you should really speak to them, right? So I think it's also about, you know, I think in that way the activism isn't performative, or your ability to speak and maybe be more visible because you do have more social capital and social power. You use that, right, to bring along those who don't have that social capital and social power. And I think if you're doing that, then the activism is hardly performative, right? But if you're seeing the performative activism, I think it's absolutely imperative to hold it to account in certain kinds of ways, right? And to ask questions about, why are you doing this, and what would that actually mean for you? So I also think that, like, there's systemic and structural things that need to change, and we all need to find ways to address that. But I also think that if you are an individual person and you're seeing what's going on and you're appalled by it, right, and you want to do something different, think about, well, in this particular case, how do Black queer lives matter in your own life, right? Like, what are you doing to support, encourage, enable, whatever, even if that's like checking certain jokes that your friends make, or being critical of the use of certain kinds of memes, that are just supposed to be funny or a joke, right? Um, or thinking about, like, can I extend opportunities? Maybe if I have a particular resources, how could I share that with someone who's a Black queer creative or a Black queer activist or someone like that? So I think that those are the ways that we can think about how we can do solidarity. I prefer the term solidarity rather than allyship. I think that allyship often is performative. I think solidarity is about recognizing kind of a similarity of cause, and finding ways to offer mutual aid and support.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're near, well, we're at 4. I'm gonna give you our last question. And just for the viewers out there, we're recording this lecture, and it's also going to be saved on the events page, but we will be uploading a different version of this with a transcript with closed captioning that's done automatically through Zoom, just so like non-hearing folks can also have access to this. But yeah, thank you all for joining us, and this is going to be our last question. Yeah, so the last question is there a possibility in which queer Black lives can be treated equally under a capitalist system?
I'm gonna be honest with you. No, I don't think so. I think we can make it better, right? I think we can push for social programs and more investment in social welfare that will make it better while this system continues to exist, right? But I don't. And honestly, look, I think for anyone who's not in the top 5%, you know, the capitalist system is not a livable system. I think that we tell ourselves it's livable, like we tell ourselves, hey, I'm a professional, I got my degrees, I'm making my six figures, I'm doing fine. But I mean, one of the things that I tell people is that uh, I say there's no such thing as a middle class, right? Because it's an obfuscation that's used to separate people who have certain kind of cultural capital and education from everyday workers, right? So that you can think that you're a little bit better, right? And that you're a little bit better off in the system, right? But we know that like most people who are even making $200,000 a year, right? If they miss a few paychecks, right? They're out on the street, right? And so my whole thing is if you have to get up in the morning and go to work every day, you're working class. Now you might make more money for that work, but like, true wealth, right? And true elitism are people who don't have to work, right? And so I try to get people who are like professional and educated to think of themselves as working class as well, right? Because to afford that house, to afford that car, to afford that vacation, there are people in this world that can do all that and they literally don't have to get up and work, right? But you do. Now you're making more money than the trash collector or the person working at McDonald's, but at the end of the day, we're all working class. So my point is that like I don't think the system works for anyone except for the those at the very top of it. Some would even say the top 1%, but it is particularly brutal, right, to Black queer folks. And so, no, I don't think so. But I'm also going to say this: I don't think that socialism or Marxism resolves racism and heteronormativity. I think that it can go toward that, right? But there's still work that has to be done in relationship to anti-Black racism and in relationship to heterosexism, right? And homophobia and transphobia, trans misogyny, like all of these things don't just disappear because you get rid of capitalism, right? Capitalism exacerbates all of those things. And oftentimes capitalism relies on racism, on misogyny, on heterosexuality, right? It relies on these things. Um, but these things can exist outside, right? A capitalist system. So I think that abolishing such a system, right, and replacing it with something else would, of course, go a long way towards allowing Black queer people to actually have lives that matter, right? But there's still going to always be there. There's still going to always be things that we have to work on as a society um, that the economic system doesn't totally explain, right? The economic system explains a lot, but it can't explain everything. And so I think that that's the way that I would say. So no, I don't think so, not in a capitalist system. What I will say is that as long as we have that system in place, this is where my pragmatism comes in, right? Then we can try to do things to make sure that within that system, right, that we can get more social welfare, we can get public health as a single payer option, we can make sure that minimum wages keep up with cost of living. We can make sure that housing is not a consumptive um, um, project, but rather is a right, right? It's a right for people to have a safe, clean, functioning home to live in, right? So I think if we can do those things in the meantime, then I think that can go some direction towards ameliorating the kind of dystopia that Black queer people have to live with. Um, but ultimately, you know, the dismantling of that system will be necessary. Replacing it with something else will be necessary. But let's also not pretend that you know, everything that happens in relationship to anti-Black queerness is just about a capitalist system, because unfortunately it's not.
Yeah, having said that, that was your last question. So I want to thank everybody else for joining us. Dr. Liverman, it was a pleasure having you here. And I think that I took away from this a lot from this conversation, and I hope that all the viewers did too. Um, just a reminder, we are going to post this this same live on our Senate Facebook page and also our website with closed captioning, just so that all folks have access to it. And Dr. Liverman, are you going to be teaching a course next semester that people might want to know about?
I am going to be teaching a class in African queer studies that could be of interest to people who are interested in these conversations. So I could definitely promote that class, but I would also, just in a larger case, just promote a number of different classes that are being offered in our department in ADS, that's African and African Diaspora Studies. I really would strongly encourage folks to just look at those course offerings. I think many of them will touch upon these different issues, even if they don't explicitly touch on queerness. But we will have, I think, 3 or 4 classes on the books in the fall that will deal specifically with Black queerness. So I encourage people to sign up for those. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you guys for doing these things. I think it's really great. I hope that I was able to, you know, offer something. And yeah, I just wish everyone, you know, wellness. And, you know, we're in for a little bit of a bumpy ride, but I think that I'm also heartened by the work that young people, that young folks at UT, that young people around this country are willing to do to try to really rethink and change these systems. So, and I'm just, you know, I'm happy that I'm able to be here and witness it. So any way that I can be a support to people who are trying to do that work, I'm definitely humbled to be able to do so.